If I asked you the question, what do you think about when you think of Ninjago that isn't a specific character, what would you answer with? Would you talk about the location of the show? Would you talk about, say, the Monastery of Spinjitzu? Or would you talk about a vehicle from the show like the Bounty? Or just a season of the show you really enjoy? Who knows? But personally, I think of Spinjitzu itself. I mean, it was literally the subtitle of the show for the first 10 seasons, and to this day, Spinjitzu is used in near enough every single episode. But it made me think of the question, how effective actually is Spinjitzu? How strong is it in battle? And this led me down a rabbit hole, I have to say. I have spent a bit too much time lately looking at scenes where the ninja use Spinjitzu for me to admit to. But I do think I have a somewhat decent idea on the effectiveness of the martial arts. But hey, here is the obvious question, what actually is Spinjitzu? You see, the thing is, Spinjitzu is the art of jumping up, kicking back, whipping around. No, I'm joking. I have to assume anyone who's watching this video does understand what Spinjitzu is. And if you don't, watch Ninjago. But to actually get into things, the thing I had to consider most of all is how Spinjitzu has evolved over time. And I'm not just talking purely about how Spinjitzu is used throughout the show, I'm also considering how Spinjitzu looks throughout the show. Because after reviewing most of the scenes of Spinjitzu from the show itself, I have reason to believe that the visual changes are more than just visual, because in certain instances, it feels almost different, but I'll explain that properly in a minute. But to start it off simply, let's talk about one simple thing. The fundamentals of Spinjitzu. Spinjitzu is an art form that really taps into the balance of the user itself. It calls on the energy of the user and it makes its way through as the vortex that we all know and love. But the thing is, there is more to it than we actually realize. There is an energy to Spinjitzu, and that is why it is considered a powerful art form, and it's not one that just anybody knows, because it actually requires a lot of energy to produce. But what are the main abilities that come from Spinjitzu itself? Well, they remain somewhat the same throughout, but there are certain instances where Spinjitzu does do different things. The most reliable one that it does do is be able to counteract the ninja's enemies. It's very easy to say that most of the time, Spinjitzu does successfully help in the aid of battle. It adds a force and a momentum to what they do when they are attacking someone, but it goes a bit more specific in certain instances. There is an implication that Spinjitzu itself actually slows down time within its vortex, because we have seen multiple scenes of the ninja being able to attack enemies in a much quicker rate than the enemies are themselves. You can mainly see this when Jay first uses Spinjitzu, because he's able to hit the skeletons without them actually being able to react. And the other main instance is at the start of the Tournament of Elements, where Lloyd uses Spinjitzu on Ninjroids and they are much slower compared to him. The other main thing I've noticed is that Spinjitzu can be used to get to certain places a lot quicker than you would be able to on foot, and there are too many examples to list off for this. I'd say it's especially come into play the speed of Spinjitzu in Dragon's Rising, because there are plenty of scenes where the ninja will use Spinjitzu as a means of transport, and to say the least, it works really well. But I would say that's the most steady instance of abilities that Spinjitzu has, but there are some extra ones that I will mention. One of them being the ability to change your clothes. I don't know how reliable this is, but they do it a lot in the earlier seasons, so I have to say it's somewhat of an aspect, but it could also play into the slowing down time part. There's also the odd occasion where Spinjitzu can be used to get through something, and I would say the main instance of this is in Skybound, where Kai uses it to go through the floor. But again, you could probably attribute this to the fact he's the master of fire, and the fire element is conjured in his Spinjitzu tornado. And again, talking in terms of more what's been introduced in Dragon's Rising, I would say there are a couple of instances where you could say Spinjitzu can give you somewhat the ability to fly, because the ninja do use it to get their way around. Mainly look at the episode of Cloud Kingdom where Kai and Nia are basically flying with their Spinjitzu. And yes, I do understand that they also did have help from the Master of Wind, but there are some instances where they don't have her on hand. So again, it's just a weird one. But I would say, to an extent, there is an ability to fly with Spinjitzu. But I would say for the most part, that is the fundamentals of Spinjitzu and its main ability set, but it doesn't answer the question of how strong it truly is. Now here's one of the things I think that comes into play. Yes, that is correct. I do think to an extent there is an elemental aspect to Spinjitzu, because while you don't have to be an elemental master to use Spinjitzu, I do think there's an argument that it makes it stronger. Because I have to say, that's one of the main things I observed while researching this video. If you look at Spinjitzu, when the ninja use the element, it feels notably stronger. I would say the main place to see this is in Season 8, because the ninja all have their own unique wind-up that uses their element when performing Spinjitzu. And in those 3 seasons, Spinjitzu feels more powerful. And that is why I brought up the design basis for Spinjitzu, because I would like to consider it as each individual look of Spinjitzu is to an extent canon. But now you're going to have to hear me out, because I know I'm somewhat going to be wrong here, and the answer is ultimately they just wanted a design change. But I think there is an honest argument to be made that Spinjitzu, the look of Spinjitzu more specifically, is affected by the elemental use of the user. When the ninja first learns Spinjitzu, and the Spinjitzu we see throughout season 1 through 7, it has an elemental aspect to it, but we never see the ninja use their element when using Spinjitzu. And that's why it has their element, but it looks more just like a standard tornado. But then you do get to season 8 through 10, where the elemental tornadoes are much more based on their element, and you can see that in the design. But what's the main difference? You can see that the ninja most of the time use their element before using Spinjitzu. They are conjuring up their elemental power to perform the art. And here's the thing, like I said, Spinjitzu does look more powerful. I mean, look at the episode The Game of Masks. All the ninja use their elemental powers to attack Krabby. Now, if you look at the scene, each ninja uses their element beforehand, and look at the results. The best example is with Zane in that scene, because he uses so much of his ice power to freeze up Krabby that I just wouldn't expect it from a standard play. Because the only other time we see that much ice come from Zane is when he has the Staff of Forbidden Spinjitzu. Other than that, we never see that kind of effect. So what if there is an actual aspect of Spinjitzu we're missing here? What if using your elemental power makes Spinjitzu more powerful and changes its look to a more elemental based attack? The other best example here, when you compare the initial Spinjitzu from the first 7 seasons to Oni Trilogy Spinjitzu, is how the wind affects it, because we do have a comparison here. If you look at season 5, where Moro is attacking the ninja with his elemental power, Spinjitzu is immediately counteracted with that power. But if you then look at the episode Dread on Arrival, where there is a other realm type of wind coming through, the ninja with their Spinjitzu is able to get through the wind. Now, I know you can make the argument that the ninja were all using Spinjitzu at once compared to the ninja going at Lloyd or Moro one at a time, but I would still make the argument that all of them together still wouldn't have been able to counter Moro in that instance. Because even when it is just Lloyd who is trying to get through the wind to get to Harumi in that scene, you can see that he is not being blown off of his feet like all the ninja were in season 5. He can't get through, but he's also not failing. And that's why I do think there is an elemental aspect to Spinjitzu, because there are still so many more examples of Spinjitzu in those few seasons that I can bring up. But for the sake of runtime, I will move on to the next visualization of Spinjitzu, and that's of course the Wild Brain era. Now you can look at this Spinjitzu and say, well, it's not as elemental looking as previous Spinjitzu, so now my point is completely gone. But I have to disagree, because there are a few scenes that help my point. Now the ninja all went back to a more unified look of Spinjitzu. They're all the standard tornado, whereas in season 8 through 10, some of them had different design bases. But there's still a very big elemental aspect to Spinjitzu for each of them. And the main example is the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu, because once it is in the user's hand and the user's elemental power is amped up to the extreme, look how Spinjitzu looks. It is so much more elemental based than the standard Spinjitzu of that season. Now that is why I'm thinking the elemental aspect is there and increases the strength of the art form. Now I get the Forbidden Spinjitzu is technically a different art form, but at its fundamental point, it is Spinjitzu. It's just a powered up version of it. Now here's the thing, what happens when they're using that version of Spinjitzu? They are able to absolutely crush it, similar to the Oni trilogy. And if you want non-Forbidden Spinjitzu examples, then may I direct you to the Master of the Mountain, where Nia has to fight using Spinjitzu. She was completely unsuccessful while fighting Murtessa in that episode, but the thing is that when she uses Spinjitzu, she conjures up her powers of water, and what happens? She completely wipes the floor! But that is the same fundamental aspect that we see in season 8 through 10, because Nia's using her power to create Spinjitzu, and look how much stronger that it actually is. Now of course this does beg the question of why don't the ninja continue to use this Spinjitzu in a more elemental form? And I don't really have the answer, but I can give you a theory. The first argument I could make is that the ninja feel more complacent as of the time of the Wild Brain era. Considering that they just defeated the Oni, they clearly went into more of a state of relaxation. But if you want more of a proper excuse, you could make the argument that they don't believe they need to use such a strong form of Spinjitzu in an instance where it's not really necessary. Because you could see that they do use it in instances where they need it. Because the elemental essence of Spinjitzu is still used in these seasons, like I said. But the point is that they may not think it's necessary in an instance where they don't necessarily need it. So if you do want another instance of a ninja realizing they need a more powerful version of Spinjitzu in a fight, then let's look at the reimagined short, The Sweatin' to the Goldies. Now, if you consider this short canon or not, I'm going to go off the basis that it is canon. Which obviously means Narukon is out there, but hey ho, let's just allow it. It's my video. When Zane and Jay are fighting against Reflectra, you can see that they underestimate her to an extent until they realize the extent of her powers. And what does Jay do in reaction? Oh, there it is. He uses his lightning to make a more powerful version of Spinjitzu, and he lasts longer in this fight. The only reason he loses is because Reflectra's whole gimmick was that she knew what they were doing and she knows how to counter it. But the point is that before Jay and Zane realized what they needed to do, the longest Jay lasted in that fight was with an elemental version of Spinjitzu. But let's go to the last design change of Spinjitzu, where I still believe that my point stands. And here's why. The only reason why I would say I'm not fully consistent with Dragon's Rise and Spinjitzu is the fact that it has the trail that I could make the argument for when it came to the Oni trilogy Spinjitzu. But it doesn't ruin my point. This is because when the ninja do Spinjitzu in Dragon's Rising, there's still the elemental tornado that I said that the Wild Brain era one has. But when the ninja got powered up by the dragons, it became so much more elemental. And why? Because the dragon power-up enhanced the powers, not the tornado. If you look at season 1 episode 2 when Lloyd does Spinjitzu, you can see that it's still got that standard elemental look. But when the dragons power Lloyd up, they power up his elemental powers and not his Spinjitzu. I mean, look at Sora. But Lloyd performed Spinjitzu in this form, and look how much stronger Spinjitzu actually was. But while it's short and sweet when it comes to Dragon's Rising, that is the universal effect of Dragon's Rising Spinjitzu. And that's why I will make the argument that the elemental power does enhance Spinjitzu. So now I've explained why I think Spinjitzu is affected in its strength. Now let's take a look at the actual strength itself of Spinjitzu and answer the question I set out to give. Now when it comes to Spinjitzu in its standard form, I do think it's quite strong, but I think the main difference is that it can be easily countered. While Spinjitzu used correct in any form is a very strong martial art, I do think under the right circumstances and if the combatant is skilled enough, they can counter Spinjitzu. I mean, look at Pythor in season 2. All it took for Pythor to defeat Wu Spinjitzu was just to hit him with his staff, and you could attribute that just to any other circumstance, but canonically speaking, Pythor beat Spinjitzu in this instance. And like I said, there are just so many instances of standard Spinjitzu not being able to counter the enemies. And I could give you a ton, but I really don't want to pad out the watch time. So here's a very quick list of a bunch of them. But like I said, I do thoroughly believe when an element is channeled through Spinjitzu, it makes it several times more powerful. And there are so many instances again throughout the show. Because I didn't even mention how an elemental weapon can affect Spinjitzu. I mean, Cruncher and Knuckle use a very decent form of Spinjitzu just by holding the Sword of Fire and the Nunchucks of Lightning. And if you don't like that example, if you look at Season 1, when Zane is training with the Shurikens of Ice, his Spinjitzu is notably more powerful, to the point where he even freezes over the monastery. But that's why I think Spinjitzu is more powerful based on elemental powers, and I'm hoping I've shown you why today, and also why you could look at each variant of Spinjitzu that we've seen as being canonically the look at that point in time, and you could look at it as the power level of Spinjitzu. In its most simplest terms, Spinjitzu in its base form clearly seems powerful enough to get the job done, and I don't think it's a weak martial art whatsoever. But, like I said, once you introduce that elemental power into Spinjitzu, I think it's debatably the strongest martial art that we've seen in Ninjago. And that is why they are the defenders and the protectors of Spinjitzu, and why not everyone is taught that martial art. But let me know what you guys think about what I presented to you today, and let me know if you do want more videos of me talking about certain aspects of Ninjago, because I'm gonna be honest, this was a lot of fun. I had so much fun looking in depth into what Spinjitzu actually is, and I'm gonna be honest, I feel like I've got a whole new appreciation for Spinjitzu now I've looked into it more. But let me know what you guys think of what I've shown you today. But just like that, that is the end of the video, and thank you guys so much for watching. And like I said, let me know if you want more videos like this, because I'm tempted to look into Air Jitsu next, but that's dependent on whether you guys like this style of video. But that's about it guys, take care, okay,